In the early 1930s, if you wanted to fund the most violent paramilitary group in Germany, you didn't actually have to buy a weapon.
Right. No black market deals required.
Yeah, you didn't have to launder money through a Swiss bank account or, smuggle gold across a border. You just had to walk into a corner store and buy a cheap pack of cigarettes.
A brand called Trommler, specifically.
Exactly. And it completely upends our standard perception of how extremist movements build their war chests.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we are so conditioned to look for grand, dramatic villainy in the ledger books,
Yeah.
but we rarely look at the mundane, everyday habits of the standard consumer.
Which is exactly why today's source material is so fascinating. We are taking a deep dive into an excerpted Wikipedia article about a defunct company from 1920s and 30s Germany.
The Sturm Cigarette Company.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is to explore how a completely ordinary, everyday consumer good was literally weaponized,
Right.
basically used to fund and fuel a paramilitary organization.
Specifically the SA, the Sturmabteilung, which was the original paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party.
Yeah. And before we get into the actual mechanics of this, I want to make something very, very clear to you, our listeners.
Very important point here.
Right. Because our source deals with the Nazi Party and the SA. We are explicitly stating that our goal today is absolutely not to endorse or validate or make light of any viewpoints or ideologies of these historical figures.
Definitely not.
Our purpose is purely to impartially analyze the historical mechanics detailed in the source material. We want to understand how politics and consumerism violently intersected.
Right. So we can recognize the architecture of coercion, but without in any way endorsing the actors involved.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. If we think about how this actually functioned, it wasn't like a voluntary political fundraiser.
No, not at all.
Imagine a violent political militia launching a consumer lifestyle brand just to keep the lights on. It's almost like, I don't know, like a street gang running a hyper-aggressive branded bake sale.
That is a wild image, but it's incredibly apt. Yeah, but to really understand how a political militia ended up in the tobacco manufacturing business, we first have to look at the sheer economic desperation of late 1920s Germany.
Right. The context is everything here.
Exactly. The SA was essentially the muscle of the Nazi Party. But, muscle requires funding.
Always does.
And at this specific point in time, the SA actually charged no membership fees to its recruits.
Wait, no fees at all? So how are they surviving? I mean, if you have thousands of men marching around, you have to feed them, you have to clothe them.
Right, and house them. They were entirely dependent on handouts.
From the party.
Yeah, structural donations from the Nazi Party leadership. But the party itself was constantly stretched thin. They were essentially broke.
Wow. Okay, so where do cigarettes come in?
Well, meanwhile, you have the broader German cigarette market. Following the First World War, a lot of the smaller independent cigarette firms had totally collapsed.
It was basically a monopoly.
Pretty much. The market had become heavily consolidated. It was dominated by a few massive, highly automated corporate monopolies. At the time, they were known as the Concern or the Combine.
Right, the trust. And the Nazi Party was already leveraging that economic anxiety, right? Because they were actively attacking this consolidated tobacco industry in their propaganda. They were claiming it had, foreign and Jewish connections.
Yes. They are loudly denouncing the very concept of these corporate monopolies.
Right, making them the bad guys.
Exactly. But simultaneously, they're staring at an empty bank account. They realize they desperately need an independent, massive income source.
Which brings a very opportunistic entrepreneur out of the woodwork.
Yes, Arthur Dressler.
Right. So in 1929, this guy Dressler approaches the SA with a pitch. He essentially says, look, you have tens of thousands of loyal men. Let's found a cigarette manufacturer together.
A joint venture.
Yeah. He says your SA members will exclusively smoke our product, and in exchange, the SA gets a royalty on every single pack sold.
Dressler was basically proposing a captive market.
A completely captive market.
And the specific royalty rate he pitched was between 15 and 20 Pfennig for every 1,000 cigarettes sold.
Wait, let's look at that math for a second. If cigarettes are selling for just a few Pfennigs each, a 15 to 20 Pfennig return on 1,000 cigarettes is, it's microscopic.
It is. It's fractions of a percent.
So how does that possibly fund a paramilitary army?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it relies entirely on staggering volume. Yeah. Dressler understood that if you mandate consumption across a rapidly growing fanatic base, those fractions of a penny accumulate into millions of marks.
That makes sense. But An idea doesn't build an industrial factory.
It certainly doesn't.
You can't manufacture billions of cigarettes with just a handshake agreement. You need heavy industrial capital.
Which the SA absolutely did not have.
Right. Our source details the initial financials for this venture. They officially registered it as the Cigarette and Fabric Drethler, though it became known as Zigarette and Firma Sturm.
The Sturm Cigarette Company.
Yeah. So the Nazi Party leadership offered 30,000 Reichsmarks in startup money, which, for setting up an automated manufacturing operation to compete with corporate giants, 30,000 marks is practically an insult.
Oh, it wouldn't even cover the cost of the industrial rolling machinery.
Let alone the raw tobacco leaf.
Exactly. Or the warehouse space, or the distribution network. It was nothing.
So they needed a massive bailout on day one.
They really did.
And a Nazi Party supporter named Jacques Bettenhausen had to step in. He injected a staggering 500,000 Reichsmarks.
500,000 marks?
Yeah. That injection wasn't just a friendly donation. It was the heavy industrial capital that actually took this from a theoretical grift to a viable factory.
Completely. Without Bettenhausen's capital, the Sturm Cigarette Company would never have existed.
Right.
He bankrolled the infrastructure necessary to actually monetize the SA's base.
But I have to push back here because this underlying business strategy still seems fundamentally flawed to me.
How so?
Well, we're talking about the late 1920s and early 1930s. The Great Depression is ravaging the globe.
True.
Unemployment in Germany was skyrocketing. It eventually peaked over 30%. And the SA specifically recruited heavily from these unemployed, desperate young men.
They did.
So if your entire consumer base is flat broke, why are you trying to sell them a consumer product like cigarettes?
Well, again, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we really have to shed our modern perception of cigarettes as a discretionary luxury.
Right.
In the culture of 1920s Germany, tobacco was a heavily ingrained, almost physiological necessity for these men.
It wasn't optional.
No. A typical German smoker at the time consumed about 15 cigarettes a day.
Wow. So it isn't a treat they buy when they have extra cash. It's a baseline daily requirement.
Precisely. And the economic data from the period is staggering. Even an average intensity smoker buying the absolute cheapest brand available would spend about 1/10 of their entire gross income on cigarettes.
10%.
10%.
I mean, let that sink in for a moment for you listening right now. Imagine taking 10% of your gross monthly paycheck before taxes, before rent, before groceries, and being chemically and politically compelled to spend it on a single consumable product.
It's terrifying, but it illustrates the raw power of the addiction model.
Yeah.
For the SA, nicotine addiction provided a guaranteed recurring revenue stream.
They didn't even have to ask for donations.
Exactly. It bypassed the need for voluntary donations. It extracted a tiny, non-negotiable tax from hundreds of thousands of men day after day.
But having an addictive product in a factory doesn't automatically equal market dominance. The SA still had to convince, or I guess more accurately, force a population to abandon their preferred brands and buy Sturm cigarettes instead.
Right, and they were going up against huge established brands.
So how did they actually structure this product line to capture a totally destitute market?
They utilized a highly calculated psychological and economic market segmentation.
Meaning they didn't just sell one type.
Exactly. The factory didn't just produce one generic cigarette. They produced 4 main brands, tiered by price, to capture every possible sliver of their impoverished base.
Okay, let's break down that pricing tier, because it reveals exactly how bad the economic crisis was. You had their premium brand, called New Front, which was the most expensive at 6 Pfennig a cigarette.
Right.
Then you had Sturm, meaning storm, at 5 Pfennig, Alarm at 4 Pfennig, and at the very bottom, Trommler, or Drummer, which was the absolute cheapest, at 3 1/3 Pfennig.
And the sales data perfectly reflects the crushing reality of the Great Depression. The premium brands, they were essentially window dressing.
Nobody was buying the 6 Pfennig ones.
Exactly. The source notes that in 1932, a massive 80% of all Sturm cigarettes sold were the dirt cheap Trommler brand.
8%.
Yeah. And as the economy worsened into 1933, that jumped to 95%.
So they were running a volume business on the absolute poorest segment of society.
Entirely. But they didn't just rely on cheap prices. The marketing machine they built around Trommler and the other brands was incredibly aggressive.
Oh, yeah. The source talks about how they had dedicated sound trucks driving through neighborhoods, just blaring advertisements.
It was inescapable.
They even hired planes to drop leaflets or fly banners overhead. And the messaging itself was pure, concentrated political grievance.
They explicitly weaponized the economic anxiety of the era. Their early advertising heavily featured the slogan, "Against the Trust and the Combine,"
directly attacking those established corporate monopolies we discussed earlier.
Exactly. During the worst of the economic crash, between 1930 and 1932, their print ads frequently depicted catastrophic situations. They were visually linking the failure of the German economy to the rival tobacco corporations.
And then there was the physical packaging itself. Inside the cigarette packs, they included collectible sets of images featuring historical German military uniforms.
Right, like baseball cards, but for militarism.
Which seems like a strange prize for a political party's quote-unquote sports and gymnastics division.
Well, the sports and gymnastics label was a very thin legal fiction. The SA used it to avoid being banned by the government.
Right.
In reality, they were actively promoting themselves as a massive shadow military training program.
Now, the source mentions the SA framed themselves as the successor to the banned Freikorps militias.
Yes.
What exactly were the Freikorps, and why does putting their uniforms on collectible cigarette cards actually matter?
So the Freikorps were rogue, right-wing paramilitary units composed of bitter veterans that formed immediately after Germany lost the First World War.
Right.
They were notoriously violent, and eventually they were banned by the Weimar Republic.
So they were basically violent outlaws.
Yes. And by including collectible cards of historical military and Freikorps uniforms, the SA was psychologically grooming its consumers.
Normalizing the violence.
Right. They were making the prospect of militarization and serving in a violent street army look glorious and historically validated.
Here's where it gets really interesting. They are building this brand loyalty through psychological grooming, but they didn't actually trust their members to willingly buy the product.
No, trust was not part of the equation.
This wasn't just a marketing campaign. It was literal mafia-style racketeering. The source makes it abundantly clear. SA members were compelled to smoke Sturm cigarettes under threat of physical and financial punishment.
It was an internal mandate, enforced through systematic humiliation and penalization.
Bag searches, right.
Exactly. If you were a member of the SA, your superiors would conduct unannounced bag and pocket searches.
Wow.
And if they found a rival brand of cigarettes on you, you weren't just scolded, you were hit with a strict financial fine.
I mean, imagine your employer demanding to search your pockets to ensure you're only consuming the company's proprietary product, and then docking your pay if you bought a competitor's brand.
It's unbelievable.
It is a closed loop of extortion. But the coercion didn't stay internal, did it?
Yeah.
They took this violent enforcement out into the public market.
They really treated the free market as a literal battlefield.
Right.
The SA actively agitated against the use of other brands by the general public, and they reserved a special, targeted hostility for the actual market leader.
A massive tobacco corporation called Riemsma.
Yes, Riemsma.
And they didn't just write angry op-eds about Riemsma. SA men physically attacked the retail shops that dared to stock Riemsma products.
Physical violence.
They smashed storefront windows, they dragged shop workers out, and physically beat them in the streets. This is violent market monopolization disguised as a grassroots political boycott.
They were using paramilitary street violence to artificially inflate their own market share.
And to terrorize their corporate rivals into submission.
Exactly.
Okay, I have to stop us here for a second, because anyone who knows even a little bit about this era is probably screaming at their audio player right now.
I know exactly what you're going to say.
Right. There is a massive historical contradiction staring us right in the face.
Yeah.
It is heavily documented that Adolf Hitler was famously rabidly anti-smoking.
Oh, he despised the habit.
So how does a violently enforced state-sponsored tobacco monopoly thrive under a dictator who actively hates the very product they are selling?
It highlights the profound disconnect between a dictator's ideological purity and a state apparatus's pragmatic, desperate need for revenue.
Money talks.
Always. You are entirely correct. Hitler detested smoking. He even ordered localized bans across party offices and certain public spaces.
But the source explicitly notes those bans were widely ignored. How do you ignore a dictator's mandate in an authoritarian regime?
Because the entity guarding the treasury, the finance ministry, vetoed the ideology.
The bean counters won.
They did. The finance ministry absolutely loved the tax revenue that tobacco generated. To understand the scale, by 1941, roughly 1/12 of the entire German state revenue came exclusively from tobacco taxes.
Over 8% of the national budget.
Exactly.
You don't just turn off 8% of a nation's income because the leader finds the smell distasteful, especially not when you're actively rearming for a global war.
Furthermore, Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, fundamentally disagreed with Hitler on this issue, and Goebbels' view ultimately dictated state policy.
What did Goebbels think?
He believed that cigarettes were absolutely essential to the psychological endurance of the war effort. They were deemed so vital for morale that they were distributed for free to soldiers as a designated part of their rations.
Even to minors, right?
Yes, even to minors serving in the military.
The result of the state actively pushing this addictive substance is just staggering. The source says between 1930 and 1940, the per capita cigarette consumption in Germany literally doubled.
Double in 10 years.
It went from 500 cigarettes a year per person to 1,000. They were selling tens of billions of cigarettes annually.
And in the early 1930s, the SA's Sturm Cigarette Company was riding the crest of that wave. By 1932, Sturm had achieved a massive turnover of 36 million Reichsmarks.
36 million. Just to put that in perspective, that is roughly equivalent to 148 million euros today.
It was a fortune.
A typical SA local unit was earning hundreds of marks every single month just from their cut of the royalties. It was a massive financial triumph.
Huge.
But that exact success, achieved by literally throwing bricks through their competitors' windows, put a giant target on the SA's back.
The corporate titans they were trying to destroy were paying attention.
Right, which introduces the pivotal figure of Philipp Furchtgott Riensma,
the head of the rival tobacco combine that the SA had been physically terrorizing.
Exactly. And Riensma is a ruthless corporate pragmatist. He's watching his shop windows shatter. But maybe more importantly, he's watching his massive advertising campaigns get banned from all Nazi Party publications by SA sympathizers.
Right, they were freezing him out of the market.
So what does a powerful corporate titan do when street thugs disrupt his monopoly? He goes over their heads and buys the politicians who hold the thugs' leashes.
A classic move.
In June 1932, Riensma secures a face-to-face meeting with Adolf Hitler, Rudolf Hess, and Max Amann, who is Hitler's secretary and the head of the party's printing house.
And the leverage in this meeting is purely financial.
How so?
The Nazi Party's publications are hemorrhaging money because Riensma's lucrative ads are banned.
Right.
The party is also desperate for immense amounts of cash for upcoming election campaigns. Riensma, conversely, needs the street violence to end and his advertisements to run.
It's a mutual need. But the source notes that Hitler reportedly scolded Riensma during this meeting for having Jewish business partners.
He did.
Yet they still walk out with a deal.
Ideological grandstanding immediately yielded to capital. Despite the scolding, they struck an initial deal for 500,000 marks worth of advertising in party papers.
Wow.
Yeah, Riensma essentially bought his way back into the market.
But the payoffs escalated to an almost comical degree once the Nazis actually seized state power. By 1933, Riensma realizes he needs permanent protection.
So he goes straight to Hermann Goering,
who was then the highest official in Prussia. Riensma complains about the ongoing SA street violence against his company, and he also mentions some pesky corruption charges he's personally facing from state prosecutors.
And Goering's response is a masterclass in autocratic corruption.
Tell me about it.
He casually quashes the court cases against Riensma in early 1934. And the price for that absolute legal immunity, Riensma pays Goering a bribe of 3 million marks.
3 million marks to make a federal investigation just disappear.
Yes.
Plus an ongoing mandated bribe of 1 million marks every single year.
It's breathtaking how cheaply the anti-corporate ideology of the party was bought out by the very corporations they claim to despise.
Which creates this unsustainable, explosive tension within the state.
Right.
You have the corporate elites like Riensma paying massive bribes directly to the highest political elites, Hitler, Hess, Goering.
Right.
But down on the street level, the paramilitary grunts of the SA are still violently enforcing their own competing Sturm cigarette monopoly, completely unaware that their bosses have already sold them out. So how does a political system resolve a contradiction that massive?
What's fascinating here is how corporate monopolization aligns perfectly with violent political purges.
Oh.
Because in July 1934, we see the Night of the Long Knives.
Right.
This was Hitler's massive, bloody purge of the entire SA leadership. Hitler viewed the SA's growing power and independence as a direct threat to his consolidation of the military and the state.
So the top brass of the SA is completely wiped out in a matter of days.
Yes. And crucially, the very SA leaders who had profited the most from the Sturm cigarette royalties, many of whom personally owned lucrative shares in the company, were suddenly dead or imprisoned.
And with the old, fiercely independent SA leadership assassinated, the corporate takeover is completed with basically zero resistance.
Overnight.
The newly appointed SA leader, a man named Victor Lutzi, steps in and almost immediately cancels the SA's manufacturing contract with Sturm Cigarettes.
Just tears it up.
Instead of running their own anti-corporate brand, he makes a deal directly with Riemsma, the corporate giant.
And the terms of the new deal reflect the total surrender of the SA's independence.
What were the terms?
Riemsma simply agrees to pay a fixed lump sum to the SA, which was 250,000 Reichsmarks in 1934, to become the sole official producer of the SA cigarettes.
The layers of irony here are incredibly dark. First, Riemsma's Jewish partners and employees, the very people the SA used as ideological justification for their violence, successfully emigrated, and notably with Riemsma's financial help.
Right.
Second, the Sturm Cigarette Company suddenly cut off from its captive audience of SA enforcers and left with a warehouse full of unsellable Traumer cigarettes, quietly files for bankruptcy in 1935.
The self-proclaimed anti-corporate street warriors of the SA, who built a brand screaming against the trust and the combine, were ultimately swallowed whole by the exact corporate combine they tried to beat in the streets.
Yeah.
Big Tobacco won by simply purchasing the political architecture that controlled the violence.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, navigating the complexities of the modern world? We're often taught to view political power as something won purely through grand historical speeches, massive election campaigns, and high-minded policy debates.
Right.
But this source forces us to confront a much more uncomfortable reality. Authoritarian power and the violence required to sustain it is often built on the most mundane, everyday consumer habits.
Yes.
It was literally financed penny by penny, or pfennig by pfennig, at the checkout counter, fueled by physiological addiction and enforced by the threat of violence.
It really demands that we look critically at the intersection of corporate monopolies, state power, and the goods we consume blindly.
Absolutely.
The forces of coercion, whether they take the form of physical intimidation in the 1930s or systemic legalized corruption today, can easily hide behind something as simple and common as brand loyalty. It reminds us that a purchase is never just a neutral economic transaction when a political entity controls the factory floor.
Which leads us right back to that violently enforced subscription model we talked about at the beginning. If historical authoritarian regimes successfully used the everyday addictive habits of the masses to literally fund their violent rise to power, what seemingly innocent everyday purchases today might be silently funding the political movements of tomorrow.
It's a chilling thought.
Something to think about the next time you tap your card at the counter. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.